hopefully the change of pace helps. And we're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to look at some data, and we're going to have our good friend and partner Arnav Kapur, who leads and manages the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's philanthropic partnerships portfolio globally with a focus on Asia, Middle East, and Africa. His work, Arnav's work, is aimed at strengthening the philanthropic ecosystem and partnering with governments, family offices, foundations, and corporations to have impact at scale across priority areas and allied areas of the foundation. And Arnav will be speaking with us about philanthropy trends in India. And with that, if I could welcome Arnav on stage. Oh,
Hi everyone. I know it's post-lunch. Okay, sorry. I know it's post-lunch and just before coffee, and also in the second half of the day. I'm sure some of you are getting the jet lag if you are traveling, and the New York rain might just keeping you inside, I guess. I think the next 10 minutes or so, I'll try to make it conversational and short and sweet. Talk about India's changing and improving and growing, but also highlight that there are lots of gaps still which need to be looked at and need to be plugged in. I mean, if you look at India as a big country, great country, in Hindi you say Mera Bharat Mahan hai. I think Mera Bharat abhi chota hai. The economy is, India is great, but the economy is still small and still growing. So we need still lots of philanthropic and private capital to fill that gap. And third, I'll just talk about the role of philanthropy and the philanthropic trends that we are seeing in the larger ecosystem and space. I had a short deck, but I don't know if it's working or not. Is it working? Okay, I'll just keep going then, I guess. Keep going. I think we have some tech issue, which is fine. Like I said, okay, can you just move to the next slide? Yeah, just change the view. Yeah. No worries. Yes, so I've been at the Gates Foundation now 9 years. I used to work in consulting before I joined the Gates Foundation. Been on our consulting strategy team, then moved to our healthcare team, agriculture team. Over the last 5 years, I've been leading our policy and partnerships work, and now lead our partnerships, philanthropic partnerships work outside of the US, which basically covers Asia, Africa, and Middle East. I'm based in our Delhi, India office. Yeah. I'm not taken the leap to move to our Seattle office because I think you need to be in the regions because that's where the action is. So like I was saying, I'll focus on 3 things: that India is growing, India is changing, but also that there are lots of gaps and the role that philanthropy is playing overall. So starting with the first, if you look at, there have been massive improvements in infrastructure in India. Highway network has gone up 2x in the last decade. Air traffic is up 3x. Almost all of India now has power. But however, we're not spending on human capital, which is the essence and bedrock of any economy, primarily health education. If you look at health, we only spend about 1.29% of GDP on healthcare, and about 3% on education. If you look at countries of similar size, it's less than half what other countries spend. There are initiatives like the Young India Philanthropic Pledge, which are entrepreneurs below the age of 45 who are committing 25% of their wealth to philanthropy. And of course, there is the Dasra Giving Pie and the Family Giving Network, which are trying to bring families together to plug that health and education deficit, which exists from the government expenditure side. I think we heard about this before. There have been changes or improvements in the health indicators overall, but still a large population has been left behind because of the focus of philanthropy and CSR on specific few geographies. So if you look at, there's been 50% reduction in MMR over the last 15 years. Stunting is also reduced. But if you look at on the right side, the MMR for the scheduled tribe population, which is about 100 million people, it's 2x of what is it for the India average. And almost 1 out of second child is stunted. So given this kind of a deficit and the kind of inequality and inequity which exists, there is collaborative philanthropy which is emerging, given some tailwinds from COVID. So there was Back the Frontline, which Dasra led. There was the India COVID Response Fund. There is Grow Fund. There's also something piggybacking on that. We are working with the Pyramid Foundation and USAID, and Anjali's on the room, on something called as Tribal Health Collaborative, which is aimed at that population to improve their health indicators overall. Innovation, is also on the rise. If you look at in India, of course, there is immense potential. There's more IITs, there's more patents being filed. There was the CoWIN app, which you might have heard about. Everyone in India has a digital vaccine certificate, and I have seen vaccine certificates of my friends and colleagues in the US. There's a stark difference in that. So about 2 billion, vaccinations have happened, and CoWIN has been the digital app which has actually made that happen. But again, the overall spend on R&D is 0.65% of GDP, which is, again, we really need to increase that spend, because Apple on its own just spends more than what India is spending as a country on R&D. And specifically in areas of agri R&D and health R&D, I think we really need to push up. US, for example, spends about 7 times of India, and their economies is about 5 times more than India. So, you can just do the math and see where we are versus the US, which is the frontline leader in innovation. But now we're also seeing that there's an evolution in giving, because some people are also going beyond and looking at R&D to spend. So Kiran Majumdar-Shaw, she's set up Ignite Foundation. There is Chris Gopalakrishnan, who set up the Center for Brain Research. And now recently the government has also included CSR as R&D as part of CSR. It wasn't included, wasn't allowed. In India, there's a rule that 2% has to be spent for companies who are making a certain threshold of revenue and profit, which is would help foster innovation, but the potential is still immense if you look at comparative examples from other countries. Again, we're seeing, on the positives, that the gross enrollment ratio for girls is increasing, even in higher education. So more girls are passing out of school, and more girls are going to school. But however, on the right, the labor force participation rate, is less than 20%. There's a variety of reasons for that. India has good policies like many other countries. They're not implemented well. So every office needs to have a crèche, for a certain number of employees, but you'll hardly find them. Right? So you need more gender-friendly policies, but also implementation of those policies needs to happen. Again, a lot of women are working in the informal sector. That doesn't get recognized, and there is, the issue of gender violence and security, which also spreads. We're seeing CSR is growing at about 13 to 15%, which is in line with the nominal GDP of the country, given the inflation is also on the higher side. And more, corporates are also allocating on women's economic empowerment. And then there are initiatives like, the Dasra Social Compact, which Deval spoke about before in the morning, which is trying to, make sure that the policies are also in the private sector much more inclusive and take everyone along. If you'll ask me fifth, which you'll ask me if one silver bullet in India, probably it looks like it's digitization, building on the JAM trinity which you might have heard about. So Jandhan, which is the Aadhaar bank accounts, and Aadhaar and mobile. So almost, a large part of the population has an identity card. They have bank accounts now, and there's also increase in smartphone penetration. The UPI transactions, which is the financial transaction, have really gone through the roof. So last month, about 6.57 billion transactions happened through UPI, and 50% of those transactions were actually under $2.5. But again, the gender adoption is low because primarily, even in households, there is one phone, and that phone is with the male of the household. So the female never gets to access the phone. If I'll ask my maid, she will carry a 2G phone. She won't have access to the smartphone. Sometimes her husband would take her phone because, just wants to make sure that he has the control in the house. So that entire disparity really exists, and, it shines through in many cases. We are working and partnering with the government, and there is also South-South cooperation happening overall on that to get more women actually serve as business correspondents, because they can help in cash and cash out of these digital transactions in the communities. And there are government schemes which says every village should have one business correspondent and one woman as a business correspondent. And again, given this digitization, there is a potential for innovation and diffusion. So a few philanthropists, including Nandan, Lekini, and others, are trying to develop a fund which can help take the digital public goods global, because you can build on this digital infrastructure, financial services, education, health, and so forth. Finally, as India is growing and improving, we are seeing changes in the entire wealth segments. But however, rich are likely to become richer, which is always the case in terms of when you have a certain macroeconomic shocks. So COVID shock, the current crisis which is going on in the world, the rich will become richer. About 250 million to 300 million population will actually have less than 1.5 lakh per annum, even 5 years out from now. Roughly about 400 million people right now are below that threshold. So we really need a lot of philanthropic and private capital to step up and close that gap of about 8 lakh crores to about 10 lakh crores, which needs to come in from the private and from the philanthropic capital side. So given this, I think in conclusion, I just want to say, given these 5-6 trends, is this India's moment or not? So on the left, you have a very famous Bollywood star, Salman Khan. And on the right, I think she needs no introduction. It's Seema Aunty from Matchmaking. I'm not sure if Seema Aunty, who's the world's most well-known matchmaker, will get the India's most eligible bachelor married or not. I'll leave that to you guys. But I'm sure that with everyone in this room, we'll have the golden decade from an Indian economy and Indian philanthropy perspective, because I think it's now the time in the next 8 years for SDGs for India to achieve. I think we really need to come together and close that gap. Thanks. I don't know if I'm good on time or not, but I'm happy to answer any questions or after this also if I'm around. Go ahead, Anjali.
Thanks so much, Arnav. I've worked with Arnav, and he does an amazing job, and he's been doing this for years, so I always learn something new from you. Can you speak to us about the CSR space and how that's impacting philanthropy, for better or worse, and what the future of CSR looks like in India?
Sure. So first, I think I should compliment Anjali back, because a lot of which I've learned is from her. She's been a great colleague and a great mentor, both at the Gates Foundation and also outside. If someone knows everyone in the space, it's Anjali. I think on CSR, I'll say a few things. So it's about 8 years now, or 9 years now, that the CSR law has been in place. Of course, in the first 3 to 4 years, so if I look at it in 3 phases, first 3 to 4 years, a lot of people looked at it as a tax. It's a 2% tax, which is being asked by the government for them to, invest in social infrastructure and so forth. So many people actually didn't set up teams. It wasn't a board level conversation. Some person in the office, primarily the human resource officer, or sometimes the finance officer or legal officer, would just kind of be signing the checks and then so forth and leave it, which was, I think, the first 4 or 5 years. The next 5 years, which has been between 17 and 22, I think people realized that we have to spend this 2% anyway, so why not actually spend it in a way that it helps the community, which is in some ways their own workers, go a little bit more outside, become more strategic in their giving, and also start looking at measurement and impact. So many, there are a lot of CSR professionals now who have been hired and specific teams have been set up. It's a board level conversation. People are spending more in, stuff like R&D and health education. Third, which is, I think, going forward, just to answer numbers, I think it's been growing at it's now roughly about $2 billion. And I think, Dasra's report says for the last 5 years, it's been growing at 15% CAGR, which I think is in line with the nominal GDP of the country. So most of the companies who make profits are actually going at nominal GDP, roughly between 10-15%. So you'll see that happen over the next few years because I think Indian economy will grow. Seems like an outlier in these days, but I hope so that it continues and actually benefits everyone. So you'll see more of that capital coming in. I think the question would be for next 5 years, how do you better make it more efficient? How do you utilize that capital much more for areas which have been left behind? I think still people will not get into some of the spaces like gender-based violence, for example, R&D. Some sensitive areas I think need much more push, advocacy, and then so forth, because these are a little bit touchy areas. On the flip side, I'll say, though it's actually increased the philanthropic giving in the country, it's become much more strategic. A lot of families have got involved. I think there's been a blurred line between family philanthropy and corporate philanthropy. So there is a little bit of, how does it help the brand of the corporate also, which kind of comes in, which is fair in some cases, but there is that, there is that blurred line, and I think in some cases it prevents some organizations to maybe do something which they might have done otherwise as families. So there are both pluses and minuses. I'll look at, there are lots of positives to come out of there. And I think it's actually made a huge impact in the philanthropic space overall, in my view. Any more questions? Thank you, everyone. Thanks for staying back.